Okay, pick it back up with George H.W. Bush, question number 8. So George Bush presided over the end of the Cold War. How are each of the following related to the end of the Cold War? So for the fall of the Berlin Wall, remember the Berlin Wall divided the city of Berlin in half. In the east was a communist Soviet aligned side. In the west was a free and democratic American aligned side. So in 1989, after continued days and days of protest, eventually some travel restrictions between East and West Berlin were eased. Many citizens traveled back and forth, and eventually citizens kind of rose up and knocked down the wall, and Berlin was eventually reunified. And this kind of symbolized the beginning of the end of the Cold War. As far as Eastern European communist governments, so again, in the late 1980s, many of these Eastern European communist governments began to start instituting reforms and allowing free elections. And once these free elections were allowed, the communist parties were kind of overturned and thrown out, and freedom and democracy was established in a lot of these countries. The important thing here is the Soviet Union does not intervene to stop this in the 1980s, whereas it had before. And again, the lack of Soviet intervention and the overthrowing of communism helps lead to the end of the Cold War. Finally, with the fall of the Soviet Union, eventually, after years and years of economic reforms, continued economic problems, and many protests and push for freedom and democracy, several of the Soviet republics that made up the Soviet Union declared independence. And finally, on Christmas Day in 1991, the Soviet Union was declared to not exist anymore. It broke up into 15 independent countries. And once that finally happened, that was the end of the Cold War. Number 9, why did the United States fight the first Gulf War in 1991? The goal was to remove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. So Iraq under Saddam Hussein had invaded the nation of Kuwait. The U.S. wanted to kick the Iraqi army out and overall protect the flow of Middle Eastern oil. This was a very successful war and led to an increase in popularity for George H.W. Bush. Now, despite his increase in popularity, he was not reelected. So Bill Clinton comes into office in 1993. One of his first acts as president was to sign the North American Free Trade Agreement. So NAFTA, again, was an agreement that removed tariffs between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. and overall established free trade. As a result of this, the price of a lot of products for consumers decreases because those tariffs were removed. But many companies sent manufacturing jobs, especially to Mexico, where the labor was cheaper. So it helped American consumers, but hurt many American workers. Number 11, why was Clinton impeached, and what was the result of his impeachment trial? So Bill Clinton was impeached for lying under oath when he was being questioned regarding some of his extramarital affairs. After he was impeached by the House, the Senate, though, eventually votes to acquit Clinton, and he was not removed from office. Number 12 asks about United States foreign policy and humanitarian military action. So under the Clinton administration, our foreign policy was largely focused on trying to, establish humanitarian efforts and help out in other parts of the world. So specifically in Somalia in 1993, the U.S. military intervenes to try to overthrow a warlord that was ruling the country. We try to end a civil war that was happening and stop widespread starvation and famine. This was ultimately unsuccessful. In Haiti in 1994, we intervened militarily to remove a very violent military coup-led government and restore democracy. We were successful in Haiti. Finally, in Bosnia in 1995 and Kosovo in 1999. As we discussed in class, our goal here was to stop genocide and ethnic cleansing and restore peace and democracy in these countries. This was eventually successful as well. Moving on to George W. Bush, we'll talk about the 2000 election. So early on, there was some faulty news reporting. Early on election night, several news stations called Gore the winner, but then retracted those statements as it became clear the election was very, very close, and in fact, too close to call. It all came down to the state of Florida. Both Bush and Gore had enough electoral votes that whoever won the state of Florida would eventually have enough electoral votes to win the election. But there were many, many problems with the ballots in Florida. We're about at our time limit, so we'll pause there and pick up with C recounts at the next video.